Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to House Resolution 8, today the committee is meeting virtually. I want to announce a couple reminders to the members about the conduct of this remote hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. Finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk whose email address was circulated prior to the hearing. So good morning and welcome to today's joint hearing of the Environment and Research and Technology Subcommittees on PFAS Research and Development. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are a class of human-made chemicals. They're used in many industrial and everyday consumer products such as firefighting foam, food packaging, nonstick cookware, carpets, and even dental floss. PFAS are known as forever chemicals due to their widespread use, persistence in the environment, and strong molecular structure that makes them nearly impossible to break down. Despite being in use since the 1940s, PFAS are considered contaminants of emerging concern as we continue to understand the negative human health and ecological impacts of these substances. There's growing consensus that PFAS are linked to negative health consequences, including but not limited to cancer, infertility, liver and kidney disease, hormone disruption, and damage to the immune system, especially in children. As a former Navy pilot, I have spent countless days on military bases. Unbeknownst to me and my fellow service members, I was in frequent contact with PFAS. Firefighting foam used on military bases, also known as aqueous film forming foaming, or AFFF, contains PFAS. AFFF has caused PFAS contamination at levels deemed unsafe by the CDC. That's why I helped secure funding in the National Defense Authorization Act to help clean up our military installations, including the Picatinny Arsenal in North Jersey. The extensive use of PFAS has led to most, if not all, Americans having these forever chemicals in their body to some degree. This is something I'm seeing across my district, from North Haledon to Verona to Stanhope and everywhere in between. In fact, this issue is so critical in my district that one of my 10 community project submissions was for PFAS remediation into PACCOM. While this issue is extensive in all communities across the country, it has disproportionate impacts on small communities who have trouble bearing the expense of remediation. It's concerning how little we know about these harmful chemicals, and even further, how limited our understanding is about what we still need to learn. I'm proud to say that New Jersey is the first in the nation to set PFAS drinking water standards, but we've only just begun to scratch the surface. Unfortunately, actions we are taking in New Jersey to reduce our exposure to PFAS through drinking water are expensive for our municipalities. I'm proud that the bipartisan infrastructure law is making real investments to fund lead pipe remediation and removal of PFAS contaminants from water systems, ensuring we have safe drinking water, but without doing so on the backs of taxpayers in New Jersey and across the country. This is a great start. But given the scale of this issue and the cost to our communities, it's clear we need to do more to support our municipalities fighting these harmful chemicals. So we must support R&D to make remediation easier and less expensive. If we don't, the cost to our communities' health will continue to compound, and that's unacceptable. There are many outstanding questions related to PFAS, fate and transport, toxicity, exposure pathways, treatment and destruction, remediation, and essential use. We know PFAS are dangerous and harmful, but we don't know exactly how many PFAS chemicals there are, but they're in the thousands. In many cases, we don't have the ability to detect PFAS that are present or measure their concentration. Questions also remain about global production volumes of PFAS, where PFAS are used, and PFAS hotspots. To answer these questions, we must support an interdisciplinary, collaborative, and integrated approach. It's critical to develop partnerships between state and local entities, academia, non-governmental stakeholders, and the federal government. Due to the cross-cutting nature of PFAS, numerous federal agencies are essential to addressing the problem. The National Institutes of Health, National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, DOD, NIST, NSF, NOAA, FAA, and of course EPA are all essential to conducting and funding research efforts for PFAS. This is an even more timely hearing for the committee as the EPA has just released their PFAS strategic roadmap, a comprehensive strategy to combat the persistent challenges of PFAS. I'm particularly pleased to see the EPA prioritizing investments in research, development, and innovation to strengthen our understanding of PFAS and accelerate remediation efforts. Additionally, the roadmap's emphasis on protections for disadvantaged communities that have been disproportionately impacted by PFAS is key as we strive to address environmental justice concerns. There's significant ongoing PFAS research and development activities, and even more in the pipeline. That's why I'm pleased to welcome our esteemed panel of PFAS experts who are well-versed on the current state of research and development. I look forward to hearing their testimony to better understand the gaps in our scientific understanding and also to identify future research needs. I'm also eager to hear their recommendations for how this committee can help facilitate research and development collaborations between federal and non-federal entities and identify opportunities for interagency coordination at the federal level. With that, I will turn it over. And so the chair now recognizes Environment Subcommittee Ranking Member Bice for an opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairwoman Sherrill and Chairwoman Stevens for holding this joint subcommittee hearing today. And thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to testify before us. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances known as PFAS are a large and diverse family of synthetic chemicals. It is not just one product or one strand that we can say is good or bad. Each individual chemistry in the family of PFAS has its own unique properties and uses. In fact, according to the EPA, there are approximately 650 PFAS currently manufactured or used in the US. Many of these chemistries are essential to products driving our lives in the 21st century. Cell phones, tablets, computers, things we use every day, components of clean energy sources like solar and wind, modern medical devices that keep us healthy, sophisticated aircraft the US military uses to keep us safe. In each of these, PFAS is the common denominator that makes them possible to produce. But because of the strength and durability PFAS provides, these chemicals have a strong molecular bond that is not easily broken down or destroyed. That is why you will hear PFAS referred to as forever chemicals. As you might imagine, a chemical that is the backbone of aqueous film-forming foam, which is highly effective at putting out the most difficult to suppress fires, is purposely designed to withstand the most extreme conditions that would destroy most other products. That presents us with the main problem associated with PFAS, removing what is already out there. Because PFAS has been used in industry and consumer products since the 40s, we know that exposure has already happened, and we face the problem of legacy contaminations in water, soil, air, and food. To overcome this challenge, I am looking forward to hearing from one of our witnesses, Ms. Amy Dindal from Battelle Memorial Institute, on her research regarding PFAS identification and destruction in the environment. As Ms. Dindal will further explain, Battelle's development of PFAS annihilator technology has destroyed 99.9% of PFOA and PFAS in water. This type of scalable technology provides proof that economically feasible, safe, complete, and reliable destruction of PFAS is within our grasp, thus solving the most fundamental issues that come with using these chemicals. As we look to the future, it is important to remember not to villainize the entire category of chemicals. The hazard and risk profiles of various PFAS are immensely different. A broad categorical ban on PFAS would be detrimental to our manufacturing sector and actually put lives at risk by reducing safety. Using certain PFAS in controlled, responsible manner is safe and effective. Understanding the distinct properties of each of these chemicals will allow us to continue the important uses and benefits of PFAS technologies. At the end of the day, removing harmful PFAS from production and cleaning up legacy contaminations to protect human health is a bipartisan issue. In 2019, the Trump administration's EPA issued the PFAS Action Plan, which was the agency's first national research, management, and risk communication plan to address the challenges of PFAS. I was pleased to see this October that the Biden administration's EPA released a PFAS strategic roadmap, which builds on the action plan. In today's political environment, everything tends to be polarized. But when it comes to the common good of protecting human health, not every precious action has to be repealed or replaced. We can and should build off of productive work, no matter the political party. It is my hope that moving forward, bipartisan efforts continue, and the same science-based decision-making and weighted benefits are considered with any proposed regulation. I want to again thank the witnesses for testifying before the committee today, and I look forward to engaging in the discussion. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Stevens, Chairwoman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl. It is a huge honor to be co-chairing today's hearing, particularly from your chairmanship on the Science Committee, Subcommittee on Environment, on PFAS, and thank you to our panelists for joining us. I am particularly excited and honored to welcome Ms. Abigail Hendershott, fellow Michigander and the executive director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, MPART. PFAS has been a topic of profound relevance for us in Michigan. In fact, it has just been a rallying call given the number of sites that we have. And as has been discussed, PFAS are a group of human-made chemicals that have been manufactured since the 1940s and can be found in a wide range of both consumer and industrial products. There's growing evidence that these chemicals are linked to adverse health outcomes, including liver damage, thyroid disease, and increased risk of cancer and reduced antibody response, particularly in children. Research has also shown that there are numerous pathways through which humans can be exposed to these chemicals. Unfortunately, PFAS is extremely resistant to degradation in the environment. And as has been discussed, this is why PFAS is known as forever chemicals. And exposure to these chemicals continue to harm the health and well-being of families across America. Again, my home state of Michigan has the most PFAS identified contaminated sites in the country, thus making it the state's biggest environmental crisis in half a century. That is our state's biggest environmental crisis in half a century. Just this weekend, I was at the holiday parades talking to municipal leaders who were saying, up north, I can't even drink the water. I can't fish in the water at my up north cabin. This is such a risk aversion for us in our state. That is why we have Ms. Hendershott in the role that she is in, but this is also why we must rely on federal responses for how we're going to tackle PFAS and PFAS cleanup and obviously prevention. So we can recognize here, particularly on the Science Committee, that the scientific knowledge is certainly still developing, and almost to our chagrin as we learn more about the serious health effects in humans and in animals. But the more we find out, the worse the picture appears. Just last month, the EPA sounded the alarm bell and asked its Science Advisory Board to review new analyses and data that suggest that two chemicals, which have been found in many drinking water and surface waters in Michigan and around the country, are far more toxic than previously thought. So while officials in Michigan are taking steps to address this issue, this crisis, there's more that can be done. Our efforts have to be strengthened by congressional action. We must recognize, and I'm proud to co-sponsor Congresswoman Debbie Dingell's PFAS Action Act, an expansive bill to regulate cleanup and PFAS contamination. This bill also includes my PROTECT Act, which directs the EPA to add PFAS chemicals to the list of hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. It's a bipartisan bill. It's absolutely our spirit here today, and it's awaiting action in the Senate. So while we still have more to learn about the extent of PFAS contamination and health risks associated with prolonged exposure, we need to acknowledge PFAS as an environmental hazard and conduct much needed research so that we fully understand the danger as well as the efforts to clean up. The National Science Foundation, and certainly this is going to be a whole of government approach, and this is why it's very very unique to have the Science Committee delving in the way that we are. The National Science Foundation supports fundamental research through multiple directorates to better understand PFAS, including the fate and transport of PFAS in environmental systems and the effects of PFAS contamination on communities. NSF supported research also focuses on developing technologies to effectively degrade, destroy, or permanently sequester PFAS in the environment. The technologies are so essential here to this cleanup. We are very thrilled to be delving into this today in our hearing. And additionally, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, works to create reference materials and data resources that can be used by government, academic, and industrial labs to increase confidence in PFAS measurements and the critical work of chemical structures of PFAS. So those are just two agencies that serve as examples. And with that, I'm slightly over time, Madam Chair, so I'll yield back. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And now the chair recognizes the Research and Technology Subcommittee Ranking Member Waltz for an opening statement.
Hey, good morning, and thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl, Chairwoman Stevens. Thanks for holding this joint subcommittee, and certainly appreciate our witnesses and their participation. And as a number of folks have said, I think always worth repeating that PFAS makes possible many of the products that power our everyday lives: lithium batteries, solar panels, alternative energy sources, PPE, firefighting foams for first responders, pipeline safety, and is also critical to our military and aerospace operations. Again, as others have noted, however, what makes these chemicals so reliable is also what makes them long-lasting when out and sitting in our environment. And obviously, which we're going to hear from our witnesses today, that can be hazardous to human health, particularly when they pollute the water supply. Scientific research is determining that not all PFAS chemicals entail the same risks. And I believe this signals that more research is needed to better understand the individual properties and characteristics of PFAS, and increased research can help us determine how to best remove legacy PFAS that are harmful to human health and the environment. And additional research can also lead to alternatives that retain the most valuable properties of PFAS. So a much more targeted solutions are out there. They do require additional research to fully understand and implement. There are multiple R&D efforts. Chairwoman Stevens mentioned a number of them across federal science agencies to advance PFAS innovations. But despite these efforts, critical knowledge gaps still remain regarding our ability to detect it, to understand its effects, to identify viable alternative options. And a coordinated federal effort in partnership with the private industry, I certainly believe is needed to help close these gaps. One of the concerns about PFAS that hits close to home for me as a combat veteran is hearing of elevated levels of PFAS in groundwater on our military bases and the health risk this poses to our military members and their families. And while high concentrations are mostly due to the use of aqueous film forming foam concentrates, I won't say that 3 times quickly, but to put out fires quickly and effectively, replacing this foam with a reliable non-PFAS alternative has proven incredibly difficult. So that's why I'm also eager to hear from our witness, Ms. Amy Dindal from Battelle Memorial Institute, on her work to create a product that can destroy the vast majority of PFAS in water in a scalable and, very importantly, a cost-effective manner. Advancements such as this gives us more tools in the toolbox to be able to combat toxic chemicals in our environment and obviously to improve public health. I also look forward to hearing about the work and research our other witnesses are conducting. I'm particularly interested in hearing what they believe the greatest research questions on this topic are and what steps we should be taking to answer them and how this committee can help. Thank you again to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Before I yield back, I request unanimous consent to submit a statement and questions from Representative Posey into the record. I assume I can get unanimous consent.
So moved, so moved.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my unmute button. Yes, without objection.
Great, thank you. I yield back.
Great. And the chair now recognizes the full committee ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for an opening statement. Is Mr. Lucas on? I don't think he's on yet. Okay. If there are any members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Elsie Sunderland. Dr. Sunderland is the Gordan McKay Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University. Dr. Sunderland's research aims to better understand how chemicals released by human activity interact with natural ecosystems and affect living systems. Prior to joining the faculty at Harvard, she spent 5 years at the Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Sunderland is also research group leader at the Center for Sources, Transport, Exposure, and Effects of PFAS, STEEP, a partnership between the University of Rhode Island and Harvard. As a part of STEEP, Dr. Sunderland works to develop statistical methods for better identifying sources of PFAS contamination in drinking water and fish, and how geochemical factors affect the transport of PFAS away from contaminated sites. And then at this time, I'd like to give the opportunity for Ms. Stevens, Chairwoman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee, to introduce her fellow Michigander, Ms. Hendershott. I yield to Chairwoman Stevens.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Cheryl. And yes, as a proud Michigander, I'm honored to introduce our next witness, Ms. Abigail Hendershott, the Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART. Michigan is unfortunately, but we are a national leader in responding to PFAS contamination. Through MPART's work, Michigan has adopted enforceable PFAS standards for drinking water and groundwater, in addition to water quality standards for 2 of the most common PFAS chemicals. Ms. Hendershott has 30 years of experience with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, otherwise known as EGLE, and has focused on PFAS response activity since 2017. She's led the team responsible for Michigan's PFAS contamination response to date, and we're so lucky to have her today testifying. And I not only do I want to thank her, but also want to thank her for testifying during MPART's 3rd annual PFAS Summit. So we're looking forward to hearing about her work and research to investigate PFAS contamination in Michigan and how to apply these lessons learned on the federal level. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens. Our next witness is Ms. Amy Dindal. Ms. Dindal is currently the Director of Environmental Research at the Battelle Memorial Institute and leads Battelle's PFAS program. Prior to joining in 2002, Ms. Dindal was a research assistant with Oak Ridge National Laboratory for 10 years. And our final witness is Dr. Peter Jaffé. Dr. Jaffé is a professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Princeton University. Dr. Jaffé's research interests relate to the physical, chemical, and biological processes that govern the transport and transformation of pollutants in the environment and their application toward the remediation of contaminated systems. Dr. Jaffé's research has demonstrated a biological pathway of PFAS degradation by an organism found in New Jersey soil, and his group is working on developing methods for bioremediation schemes for PFAS removal. As our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you've completed your spoken testimony, we'll begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses, and we'll start with Dr. Sunderland.
Thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl and Chairwoman Stevens, for the invitation to speak with you all today. It's a pleasure to go through some information on the diverse chemical family known as per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. So as you've heard already, until the 1940s or 1950s, the only source of organofluorine compounds were a few rare plant species that produce them as natural poisons. Since the 1950s, these chemicals have been widely used in modern commerce for their ability to repel, excuse me, both oil and water. Today, we find them in diverse consumer products such as food packaging, dental floss, carpet, furniture coatings, clothing, outdoor gear, and cosmetics. Airports and military bases across the country have been contaminated by use of a product that we've all heard pronounced this morning, aqueous film forming foams, or AFFF, for firefighting and fire training activities. CDC data show that 98 to 99% of Americans have detectable levels of at least one PFAS in their blood. A recent peer-reviewed study by the Environmental Working Group estimated that 18 to 80 million Americans have concentrations of PFAS in their drinking water that exceed 10 nanograms per liter. So for reference, this is in the same range as where many of the states are setting maximum contaminant levels for drinking water today. Exposures to PFAS have been associated with many negative health effects on humans. I think the former director of NIEHS, Dr. Linda Birnbaum, summarized it best when she opened a scientific meeting on PFAS a couple of years ago, when she said, if you are a public health researcher, these are the chemicals for you, because PFAS have now been associated with an adverse impact on every major organ system in the human body. Ongoing support for NIH and CDC ATSDR research is essential for fully understanding the health effects associated with PFAS. We now have two major tasks. The first one is to remediate contaminated sites across the country to address the legacy pollution issue. And the second, in my opinion, is to control ongoing production and use of these compounds in our products by deciding where uses of PFAS are essential and where they could be replaced by better, less toxic alternatives. Next to contaminated communities, drinking water is known to be the predominant exposure source. However, we have only anecdotal understanding of PFAS exposure sources for the US general population, despite their presence in all of us. Exposure research falls outside of the mandate of most ongoing research programs. Typically, this would fall within the mandate of EPA, but both their internal and extramural research has been substantially underfunded over the past decade. In Europe, dietary intake has been established as the predominant exposure source for the general population. There, PFAS have been frequently detected in seafood, milk, various meats, processed foods, particularly those that use PFAS or use food packaging containing PFAS. The FDA recently undertook a total diet survey, but the number of samples and detection limits for their analyses were insufficient to characterize the food supply and risk to the population. In states such as Maine and Michigan, high levels of PFAS have been detected on farmlands due to application of biosolids mixed with industrial sludge. These PFAS spread from the soils to hay and corn, then cows, then the farmers who drank the milk from their own animals. In one tragic case in Maine, a farmer and his wife had to close a dairy farm that had been in their family for more than 100 years. Another major challenge for PFAS research is that limitations in current analytical methods mean we are systematically underestimating exposures to these compounds. The chemical family, as you've heard, consists of thousands of compounds, and industry is continuously introducing new ones into our product stream. Standard methods endorsed by EPA and NIST currently do not detect most of the compounds found in products and the environment. As a final note, the DoD currently supports the largest portfolio of PFAS research among the federal agencies. However, DoD also caused PFAS contamination through use of firefighting foams at military sites across the country, which sets up a potential conflict of interest. And so while this research program is commendable, it is essential that the other federal agencies develop comparable research portfolios to fill the gaps above. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Hendershott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a second here. There we go. So thank you, Chairwoman Cheryl and Stevens, and to the committees for inviting Michigan to provide testimony regarding the ongoing work of our Michigan PFAS Action Response Team to address PFAS issues. My name is Abigail Hendershott, and I am the Executive Director of the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART, as we call ourselves, and I'm pleased to share with you the Michigan perspective on research needs, opportunities to collaborate, and the need for new PFAS treatment technologies. In 2017, MPART was established as a first of its kind statewide coordinating body tasked with identifying and addressing PFAS contamination through the coordinated activities of 7 different state agencies. Governor Whitmer has been a leader on PFAS, establishing MPART as an enduring body and asking MPART to establish state drinking water standards. The focus on coordination and collaboration have allowed Michigan to effectively leverage the actions of all the agencies to swiftly identify and respond to PFAS in our communities. Today, MPART is recognized as a national leader and a model for other states to follow. While there are numerous research and development areas where federal funding and studies would be helpful, I want to focus on a few examples where states could use federal support. Research on PFAS in the food supply, development of less toxic AFFF, improved PFAS remediation and treatment technologies, and continued research on PFAS toxicology. So research on PFAS in the food supply. First, there is a need for additional studies of PFAS in the food supply. Michigan has a rich history of manufacturing and farming, and when those two exist together, there's a concern about the potential for PFAS to enter the food supply. Additionally, to support our strong and hunting and fishing communities and to inform public decision about fish consumption, Michigan has been strategically sampling fish from around our state. That is why we need our federal partners to support research to understand potential health risks posed by PFAS in food, to develop better understandings of how PFAS enters and affects the food supply, and to provide science-based guidance to food producers and consumers. More specifically, research and further evaluation of PFAS impacts to the food chain cycle through bioaccumulation and biomagnification is needed. Development of less toxic AFFF. Second, the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foam, also known as aqueous film-forming foam or AFFF, results in the dispersal of PFAS into the air, surface waters, soil, and eventually groundwater. In Michigan, we have collected over 51,000 gallons of AFFF from fire departments around the state to proactively keep PFAS containing AFFF out of our environment. As long as the military, airport, and civilian fire departments use PFAS containing AFFF, these negative consequences will continue to impact the surrounding communities, particularly in areas where residents rely on groundwater as their source of drinking water. Continued federal support is critical to ensure that the next generation of AFFF products are less toxic to the environment and also meet the appropriate performance standards needed by our firefighters. Improve PFAS remediation and treatment technologies. As Michigan tackles the job of identifying sites of PFAS contamination, the even larger challenge of controlling, remediating, or otherwise reducing the spread of PFAS remains. In Michigan, historic use of PFAS and use of AFFF over large areas such as military, industrial, and airport properties has resulted in large areas of land and groundwater in need of remediation. For example, one former automotive manufacturing site can yield millions of gallons of PFAS contaminated water, hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of PFAS contaminated soil that needs to be contained or otherwise remediated at just one site alone. Over the past 4 years, we have identified 194 PFAS sites consisting of airport, industrial, landfill, plating, tannery, and military facilities. Additional cost-effective ways for in situ remediation of large quantities of soil and groundwater is needed to be identified to get to faster and more efficient cleanups. Continued research to understand PFAS toxicology. It's well established that the exposure to PFAS is associated with adverse health impacts. In order to protect our citizens, Michigan has established water quality standards, state drinking water standards, and groundwater cleanup criteria for PFAS. We're exploring the potential for soil cleanup standards too. However, we really need better predictive models for PFAS behavior. This will enable better decision-making to protect groundwater, especially in areas where residents rely on the resource for their drinking water. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss Michigan's needs for PFAS research, and I welcome hearing from the other witnesses today and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Dindal. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Is that better?
That's great. Thank
Okay,
you.
I had a double mute. I apologize for that.
Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Chairwoman Sherrill, Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Bice, and Ranking Member Waltz. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Subcommittee on Environment and the Subcommittee on Research and Technology. My name is Amy Dindal, and I am the Director of Environmental Research and Development at Battelle. Established more than 90 years ago through an Ohio charitable trust, Battelle is the world's largest independent nonprofit research and development organization. Our mission is to translate scientific discovery and technology advances into societal benefits. Tackling the current and future technology and research challenges of PFAS is true to our mission and the DNA of Battelle. We are closely aligned with EPA's directive in its PFAS strategic roadmap to invest in research, development, and innovation that incorporate the best available science. And I'm proud to share with you today the advancements that we have made. Our awareness of PFAS began more than a decade ago when we were supporting a site investigation at a Navy site in Pennsylvania. There was a mysterious foam coming out of an air stripper at the site. We sent the foam to our laboratory in Massachusetts, where it was identified as containing PFOA and PFOS. It was then that we began tracking this suite of chemicals. In 2019, we made a corporate commitment through a multi-million-dollar investment to develop new technology around PFAS. We looked to DoD's critical needs outlined in a September 2017 DoD workshop to frame where we would invest in new technology for PFAS. In my written testimony, I have provided a summary of the technologies that we have developed to measure, sample, model, track, treat, and destroy PFAS. Each technology has a role in supporting current and future site investigation and remediation needs at both government and commercial sites. One of Battelle's most significant investments is the development of a PFAS destruction technology. Our transformational innovation is powered by supercritical water oxidation, or SCWO. In December 2020, the EPA issued interim guidance on suggested technologies for PFAS management. Supercritical water oxidation was highlighted as one of the promising destruction solutions. SCWO is not a new technology, as it's been used since the 80s to address difficult-to-treat compounds. What is new is the application and optimization of the technology for PFAS. We call our technology PFAS Annihilator, as it destroys PFAS in contaminated water to non-detect levels in seconds, leaving inert salts, carbon dioxide, and PFAS-free water behind. If there is one thing you remember from my testimony today, it is that Battelle is ready to scale and deploy PFAS Annihilator. We have been testing the technology in the laboratory for more than 2 years. We have high confidence in the technology's ability to destroy PFAS, as we have been simulating field deployments with waste samples from sites around the country. We are preparing for a January field deployment of our mobile SCWO system capable of treating up to 500 gallons per day. We are also constructing a second mobile unit that will be able to treat up to 5,000 gallons per day. Because we are a nonprofit, Battelle is able to collaboratively work with EPA on this important research. EPA just published a journal publication demonstrating the efficacy of SCWO for treating PFAS in AFFF. We have proposed and received contracts for demonstration projects to DoD's STRDP and ESTCP programs with EPA as a co-principal investigator. This enables EPA to actively contribute to the research and demonstration needs, as well as stay current on technology improvements and progress. We would like to propose 3 additional opportunities to support the development of PFAS technologies. First, increase the number of opportunities for pilot scale field demonstrations of innovative technologies. Second, utilize available advanced analytical techniques to increase known information early in the site investigation process. And third, leverage federal and private sector partnerships and collaboration to drive forward solutions. Battelle's development of advanced technologies to monitor, sample, and destroy PFAS is indicative of the progress that can be made with focused commitment. We are ready to scale and deploy PFAS Annihilator. Addressing PFAS in our environment is not easy, but with more opportunities to test promising technologies in a real-world environment, and openness to utilizing new approaches and enhancing collaboration opportunities, it can and will be done. It is an honor to provide my testimony, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Dr. Jaffé.
Thank you. Chairs Cheryl and Stevens, ranking members Bice and Walzer, and committee members. Thank you for inviting me today. It's an honor to appear before you. I'm the William Knapp Class of 47 Professor of Civil Engineering at Princeton University and a member of Princeton's Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. The views expressed in this testimony are my own. Unique challenges presented by PFAS include that there are over 4,700 PFAS compounds that have been synthesized, and the number is growing. PFAS have a wide range of molecular structures, varying carbon chain length, different functional groups such as acids, alcohols, sulfonates, and different ionic forms or charges. They can be amphoteric with hydrophilic ends and hydrophobic tails, like soap molecules, all of which affects the fate and transport environment. Hydrogen from their carbon skeleton may be either fully substituted fluorine, perfluorinated, or partially substituted polyfluorinated compounds, which greatly affects their stability. This large variability in molecular structures and property contrasts, for example, with other contaminants of major environmental and health concerns, such as polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, for which about 130 individual PCBs have been used in commercial products. And all of them are characterized by having a very low water solubility and relatively simple, similar transport properties. The key points I'd like to make today include that the large number of PFAS and a wide range of properties provide a unique challenge for conducting research on PFAS and regulating them. Hence, there's a need of moving towards identifying molecular properties that affect their toxicity, fate and transport in the environment, and potential treatment method versus studying or regulating them individually. Analyzing PFAS is challenging and costly. There's a need to, 1, develop new methods that are less costly, 2, account for this cost in PFAS-related research, and/or 3, establish facilities to analyze samples from federally funded research. DOE, with their Environmental Molecular Biology Laboratory at PNNL, and a range of user facilities at various national labs, may provide a model for such PFAS-dedicated analytical facilities. All key PFAS sources need to be identified and characterized. This is needed to obtain a complete understanding of where they enter different environmental compartments and where mitigation is needed and are most effective. A generalizable understanding of biotic and abiotic reactions that can either partially transform PFAS or degrade them completely is needed for fate and transport assessment and for the development of PFAS treatment technologies. The mechanisms and limitations of biological transformations of PFAS is needed to be better understood. They should be environment-specific, considered geochemical properties, and focus on the full range of redox conditions ranging from aerobic to anaerobic. The microorganisms or microbial communities capable of transforming PFAS need to be identified and characterized. Knowing what genes are linked to the degradation or transformation of individual PFAS or group of PFAS, and what conditions are needed for their expression would allow to predict what PFAS transformations may take place in specific environmental settings where the presence of such genes has been detected. In addition to DOD's AFFF contaminated site, access to other PFAS contaminated sites is needed to validate laboratory results, transport models, and to test site remediation schemes. Many such sites are privately owned. Agencies such as EPA could catalog sites based on the prevailing PFAS, geochemistry, and accessibility or ownership. And finally, central databases and what is known about these sites, including results of completed research or remediation projects, would be extremely valuable for researchers to model testing, validation, or identification of new research directions. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. At this point, we'll begin our first round of questions. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Currently, there are no federally enforceable standards for PFAS. This can often lead to confusion for municipalities, with some states setting more stringent standards for PFAS in drinking water. Dr. Jaffé, how could addressing gaps in PFAS science better inform the standards? And can you detail the state of the science for current PFAS standards at the state level?
Standards are set by the prevalence of PFAS and their health effects, a combination of both. And New Jersey, for example, has added a perfluoronanoic acid as a compound that is being regulated because it is more prevalent in New Jersey than other places. So I'm not a toxicologist, but I think what we need to have a combination is what is the health impact of specific PFAS and how prevalent are there to come up with specific standards. Right now, EPA is focusing mostly on PFOA and PFOS, which have been manufactured specifically by manufacturers. Less of an emphasis is on PFAS that are out in nature. Many of the polyfluorinated compounds in, let's say, AFFF can be transformed to polyfluorinated alkyl acids. They are not necessarily your PFOS. They could be perfluorohexanoic acid. And we don't fully understand the toxicity of all of them. So I think there is a need to sort of understand structurally what PFAS should be regulated instead of just looking at them as a group and a family instead of looking at them one by one.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Hendershott, would uniform PFAS standards be helpful to states that are working to address contamination? And what is the role of federal agencies like the EPA in this work?
Absolutely. So uniform standards would definitely help our entire country. Michigan has had to come up with our own standards for water quality values for surface water, drinking water standards, and groundwater cleanup criteria. And having uniform settings across our country would certainly make a better consistent message, make us all work towards a collaboration and really coalesce the science around all of our a uniform end goal of drinking water protection. So I think that's the first thing that's absolutely necessary. The role of EPA then is obviously having that national standard, having a EPA take that lead for development of a state or a national drinking water standard through the MCLs for the Safe Drinking Water Act is absolutely essential. And I'm very thrilled that they're taking those first steps and will be making efforts to have MCLs in place within the next 18 months, because that's absolutely necessary for all of our nation's public water supplies to have safe drinking water standards.
Thank you. And for all the witnesses, what is the importance of federal research and development activities in developing uniform science-based PFAS standards across the country?
I can comment on that quickly. So I think uniform standards are very helpful for avoiding confusion among the public. I guess one challenge for developing these uniform standards, and one thing that we see leading to the diversity of drinking water standards right now, is the fact that different agencies are picking different health outcomes to develop these risk-based limits. So agreeing on which health effect and perhaps focusing on the most sensitive health effects for protecting the most vulnerable populations, such as children, is very important. And with these compounds, the most sensitive health endpoint that we see does relate to immune function in children. A number of European regulatory agencies are using that immune outcome to develop more uniform and consistent guidelines, and I would encourage the agencies to think about using that in the development of more uniform guidelines. And the second point Dr. Jaffé touched on already, which is how many compounds are we regulating when we develop these standards? So it's difficult to have a uniform standard if there are different numbers of PFAS compounds or different types of compounds being considered in the regulation. And one point that I think perhaps hasn't become clear yet is that, and I touched on it very briefly in my statement, but the majority of compounds in the environment now, and most of the PFAS compounds in our products, are ones that we're not measuring with our standard methods, and they're not being regulated and they're not included in our standards. Some of those compounds that we're not measuring actually degrade into compounds that have already been associated with negative health impacts. So as we think about developing uniform standards, I would put out there that I think we need to think about a screen for total organofluorine compounds, and then think about some of these compounds that we're missing and their health impacts after that. So thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you so much. And my time has expired, so I'll now recognize Ranking Member Bice, Ranking Member of the Environment Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. My first question is to Ms. Dindal. It is my understanding that the majority of your work is funded or done in collaboration with the DoD. PFAS contamination on military complexes is a high-profile issue, and 3 Air Force bases in Oklahoma, Vance, Tinker, and Altus are in need of cleanup. In addition to this committee, I also serve on the House Armed Services Committee, so I'd like to dive deeper into how DoD projects are coordinated or utilized by non-defense research that fall under the jurisdiction of the Science Committee.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. We looked at DoD's critical needs, which were identified in the SERTUP ESTCP September 2017 workshop of where to inform our investments. All of the developmental work that we have done has been self-funded by Battelle. EPA performed an evaluation of our technology for destroying AFFF and released a journal publication. And we've also been awarded and have contracts pending where EPA is a co-principal investigator with us on DoD projects. So the performance results are definitely transferable to other agencies and to others that are dealing with commercial sites as well.
Excellent. What has your level of interaction been with the agencies, namely the EPA and the DOE, when you successfully demonstrate a technology like the PFAS annihilator? Are the results and the data sort of easily transferable to those agencies?
Yes, they are. There is information that has been generated. As I said, the EPA has just released a journal publication on supercritical water oxidation and the effectiveness for AFFF. Our interaction with EPA has been as a co-principal investigator on our DoD projects so that we can engage with them as we are progressing with the technology.
Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of PFAS incineration and how your research involves methods for removing PFAS from GAC?
Yeah, so that is correct. We have GAC granulated activated carbon will remove the PFAS from the water, but it won't destroy it. The GAC filters are typically sent back to the vendor for thermal reactivation. One of our early investments was in a process for regenerating GAC that was a non-thermal process. We have a liquid regenerant that we use, and we've developed this system so that the GAC can be regenerated without the use of thermal processes. And so once that GAC is treated with our GAC regeneration, the GAC can be reused and the regenerant can be destroyed by the annihilator technology.
Thank you for that. And my last question, Ms. Sunderland, you mentioned earlier that we're utilizing PFAS in a variety of areas, including in packaging, particularly in the food area. What is the suggestion for moving away from that?
My suggestion would be to follow the lead of the European Union and countries like Denmark, which is to phase out these products in our food packaging. There's a lot of discussion in the academic community right now on essential uses of PFAS. So where do they really convey a benefit to the product, or where can they be replaced by less toxic alternatives? And certainly there are many non-PFAS based alternatives to food packaging. A few of the states are already looking at banning PFAS in food packaging, and I think it's something that could be done with a little support quite easily on a federal level.
Okay. That's the extent of my questions. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Stevens, Chairwoman of the Research and Technology Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
You know, it's absolutely fascinating as we talk about the cleanup and the complex technologies and processes that go into it. And yet we've got to devote energy and time to thinking about prevention. And certainly we're doing both today, but the enormity of the cleanup is just astonishing. And Ms. Hendershott, I'm just wondering if you could give us the Michigan perspective of the cleanup, particularly, you know, costs, manpower, how far we can go. You know, listening to Ms. Dindal and reading through her testimony and this annihilator technology and the supercritical water infrastructure that they're putting into place, it's absolutely incredible. But then I start to think about the actual infrastructure and how far we can actually go with this. So please tell me. Yeah.
Great question. The amount of PFAS in our site. So as I said before, we have 94 MPART or PFAS sites recognized currently in our state, and we're still identifying PFAS sites every day, additional ways at which a PFAS concentration in groundwater exceeds the state standard, and then it becomes officially an MPART site. But a lot of these are legacy issues, and in large areas, we've been investigating all of our commercial airports. Almost all of our airports have significant issues. We've gone off-site to look at doing precautionary drinking water sampling around the airports, because many of these are in surrounded by residential areas, serviced by groundwater for drinking water. So it's really important to understand that, because fully identifying a site that is a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles large because of the AFFF use on these airports is really quite difficult, time consuming, and very, very costly. So when you talk about what does it take to clean up an airport, a military site, a large tannery, or a large industry, you're talking about huge investments. And while, you know, a PFAS annihilator is a great first step. I'm very excited to see that we need something that can go, we're looking at really a combination of technologies. How do we clean up the groundwater? How do we clean up those soils? How do we clean up surface water? And it's usually a combination of technologies. There's not one technology that can do all of the things that we need necessary for cleanup. And so we're looking for, is there a way to, like Dr. Jaffé's research on degradation of PFAS in the soils or in groundwater? Can we do that? Can we use the PFAS annihilator maybe for landfill leachate? Another huge issue. What do we do with our wastewater treatment biosolids? So it's not just cleanup of individual sites, but all these processes where PFAS are coming out or are in some sort of a waste stream that need to be addressed. All of those need some sort of PFAS treatment and technology to go with it.
Well, we have also on the committee another Michigander, the Dean of the Michigan Democratic Delegation, Congressman Dan Kildee, who leads our bipartisan task force on PFAS and PFAS remediation. And we spend a lot of time talking about costs, you know, and who's going to pay for it. And so you look at the cost spectrum here, we've got the identification of PFAS in and of itself is a complex endeavor. And I want to salute every single one of you, you know, who are involved with this effort, you know, academic, you know, we've got industry here, as well as state actors. That in itself is a complicated effort. Then we've got this, the cleanup, the handling, the dealing, and we can look at what gets shouldered on the taxpayers. We can recruit a fund, certainly, and then we've got this last component, which is on prevention. And so, as we look to identify our scope going forward, absolutely applauding the R&D efforts that are taking place, but also recognizing that the continuity of investment that needs to get made going forward. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'll pause on the time, Ms. Hendershott. We'll come back to you on questions for the record, particularly on what EPA should be replicating. I know you've utilized the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, and how best we can continue to serve all of you at the local level. And with that, Madam Chair, perfectly on time, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Stevens. I now recognize Research and Technology Subcommittee Ranking Member Waltz for 5 minutes. And he might have stepped away. All right, I am going to turn it over to the Committee Council for the order of recognition.
I recognize Mr. Elsie.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate everybody coming in today to discuss this very important issue. I have a quick question for Ms. Dindal. As a naval aviator, I'm very familiar with AFFF and what it does, and as well in the news recently in Hawaii, the water system for numerous families has been polluted by some leaking fuel that got into their water system. My question to you is, at what point would your annihilator be able to be used, and how scalable is it? And finally, real quickly, how much power does that thing use? It sounds like an exciting technology. I'd be hopeful that could be used on the water system in Hawaii. But is it in the next couple of years, is it going to be largely scalable? And thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful question. It's scalable today. We have a mobile unit that is capable of destroying up to 500 gallons per day. We will be deploying that starting in January. We are also constructing a larger scale system that is capable of up to 5,000 gallons per day. So it is scalable today. And I am very happy to, talk further about how that could be scaled, especially when it comes to, drinking water systems. When you talk about impacts due to AFFF, there are some existing systems that are in place treating that drinking water now. So that GAC can be used to treat, for example, the drinking water, and then an annihilator can be coupled with that. So when we're talking about scaling, it can either be scaled by itself or in combination with other technologies to perform more of a treatment train approach.
Thank you. And is the power requirement for that fairly large?
Sir, thank you for repeating the question. I knew there was another important point we wanted to cover. It is not. We can do it with a generator in the field, or we can plug it into house power. It is not energy intensive. Okay. Fantastic. And finally, I know Battelle does a lot of important work, one of which is near and dear to me, and I'm sure it is to Mike Waltz, as those of us who are deployed in combat. You do a lot of work with at Battelle with correcting nerve damage from traumatic brain injury and explosions in combat. So thank you for the work Battelle does. I look forward to seeing more important and scalable issues from Battelle. Thank you for your time today, and ahead of time, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Bonamici is recognized.
Thank you so much to our subcommittee chairs, Cheryl and Stevens, and ranking members Bison, Waltz, and especially to our witnesses for your expertise and your testimony. And I note that our subcommittee chairs are from New Jersey and Michigan, two of the states that are really leading the way at the state level on addressing PFAS. But as we've already discussed this morning, we really do need a federal standard so everyone is protected, not just those in states that have made the issue a priority. And I note that in my home state of Oregon, we have not detected as much PFAS in drinking drinking water, but our Department of Environmental Quality is doing a lot of testing. So I want to ask Ms. Hendershott, because your experience in Michigan implementing the enforceable drinking water standards, which I know New Jersey has done as well. So can you tell us what went well in the collaboration between Michigan state experts and national experts? What could have been improved, and what lessons can we at the federal level learn from Michigan's efforts over the past few years?
Fantastic question. Thank you. So when we went to look for the enforceable standards for what we set as state MCLs, or the maximum contaminant levels for the Safe Drinking Water Act for Michigan, we first started with consulting with our internal experts at the state level for health and setting what we came up with advisory levels for what we thought was appropriate based on the best available science, the research at the time, and our understanding. Then we went to the national experts and asked them and created a science advisory board similar to what EPA is doing. And actually some of those same experts were on our science advisory board as well, to get their input on whether they agreed with our assessment. Did they agree with the science? Did they have anything else to contribute? I think that was absolutely important. The next step that we did was then go to the public, talk to the public, get their input, held a number of different public hearings and events on sharing that science, that information with the public to get their input, and went through that, what is really pretty standard MCL development process for EPA. But I think the things that went very well were obviously getting the input of the Science Advisory Board, double checking our science, making sure we had the best available information, and incorporating the public input into this, because I think if we don't hear anything else from our public, they want us to be transparent. They want to know what's going on. They want to hear and have a voice at the table. And
Okay,
so
I don't want to cut you off, but I want to get to another question for everyone.
Sure.
And I just want to note, I appreciate the public input part. And I think the more public knowledge there is in the public education efforts, I know that a lot of food packaging, as we were talking about, I just learned that a lot of dental floss contains PFAS. I think the more public knows about this, the more they're going to be engaged. So for each of you, our underserved communities and communities of color have suffered disproportionately from exposure to a wide range of toxins, including PFAS. So I'm encouraged by the EPA's October release of the PFAS roadmap, which is establishing the plan to research, restrict, and remediate. So I want to ask each of you, the plan directs agencies to incorporate environmental justice considerations into programs and policies. So what opportunities do you see for the federal government to further engage on the environmental justice as it relates to PFAS research and development, prevention and mitigation? And if you could keep your answers brief, that would be helpful. And I'll start with you, Dr. Sunderland.
Sure. Thank you for that very important question. I think our first task is to understand the communities that are disproportionately impacted by PFAS. I have several graduate students working on this subject right now, and there are many broader tools that we can leverage to look at that. And then I think the point touched on earlier with which are communities equally able to afford the risk mitigation that's needed if they discover contaminated drinking water, things like this. So this.
And I'll go to Dr. Jaffé before I run out of time. I'm going to try to get quick responses from Dr. Jaffé, please.
Yes, one important thing is to identify the sources. And typically we have more contaminated sources, those close to disadvantaged communities. They need to be identified and addressed and contained.
Thank you. Ms. Hendershott? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, just for the EJ communities, I think that they have a disproportionate amount of storage and disposal facilities that end up in their communities. And so not just looking at the contamination sites, but how the PFAS would flow through their communities would be very important.
Thank you. And Ms. Dindal?
We need to ensure that the technologies are brought forward are cost effective to be able to be deployed in every community.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chairs.
Ranking Member Waltz is recognized.
Thank you. and thank you, Madam Chairman, for your indulgence. Ms. Dindal, I'd like to hear more about the PFAS Signature Advanced Analytics tool, which I understand identifies specific signatures of PFAS in areas of commingled sources. Specifically, how does this tool incorporate any machine learning AI technologies? And do you think this tool will be upgraded and improved as we advance our understanding and use of AI and ML?
Thank you, sir, for that excellent question. Certainly happy to share about our PFAS signature tool and excited to tell you about its capabilities. So PFAS signature combines analytical chemistry and data science. We use high resolution mass spectrometry where we'll do non-targeted analysis, which generates thousands of mass spectral data. We can then from there use a filtering process that we developed. That's really where our innovation is. And from that, we can also look for, using a suspect screening tool, look for up to 496 different PFAS compounds. So as I said, our innovation is around really the data filtering process, but it's also key to reducing it so that we can utilize those AI/ML techniques, which are used to train the tool on different sources and signatures of PFAS.
Oh, that's great. And so do you see, well, can you rewind the clock a little bit and just tell us a little bit more about kind of how it was developed and what went into that? Because I think it's just just as a process and an approach, something that I would hope to see replicated across the board. And what kind of collaboration did you have as you developed the tool?
Thank you for the question. We had a cross-disciplinary research approach when developing this tool. It involved analytical chemists, modelers, subject matter experts in a number of different areas in order to bring the tool. As I said, data science is really where this tool is enabled. The power comes from our ability to filter the tool. So it was a strong internal collaboration, and it is one that has significant impacts as we look at site investigation and the need for more data. The ability to deploy a tool like PFAS Signature allows more information to be learned about that site early in the investigation process, which can really improve the approach we take to, and really better inform those approaches that we take to remediating the site.
So how do we, Ms. Dindal, how do we, I don't know, say this, what's needed to ramp up the use of tools like these, right? I mean, such as the signature and your predict tool. How do we get them more widely adopted? And then how can government, coordinate and to ensure these types of tools are utilized? But I think importantly, how are they, to help make sure that they're accessible?
Thank you. That's a great question as well. Increasing the number of opportunities for demonstrations of these technologies is key to getting them more widely used and accepted. More technology performance data will increase the confidence in these new approaches and ultimately accelerate cleanup times when those technologies are utilized. So right now we have a proposal pending with DoD to utilize a technology toolbox approach where we have Signature, our Predict tool, which is a groundwater fate and transport modeling tool, and our PFAS Insight, which is a passive sampling tool. We have a proposal to demonstrate all three of those technologies working in combination to support additional site investigations. So that will be key for us in order to, if that proposal is funded and we move forward with demonstrating this under the ESTCP program, that will be critical in terms of getting it widely or more adopted within the DoD.
Okay, great. Thank you. And just in the 30 seconds or so I have remaining, can you just speak briefly to what you see as the current state of PFAS alternatives research and the viability of any alternatives that we know of?
Yes, sir. I can speak from the perspective that Battelle is supporting DoD through the ESTCP program, evaluating non-fluorine forms of AFFF. And that research is still ongoing. We are doing the test and evaluation. And to this point, there has not been a a PFAS-free foam that has been identified that meets the military specifications, but that research is continuing.
Great, thank you so much, and I yield.
Mr. Tonko is recognized. You're on mute, Mr. Tonko.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I believe Representative Stansbury needed to go before me, unless that's changed.
Yes, sir. Are you yielding time?
Yes, I am, to Representative Stansbury.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for convening today's panel. Given the impacts of PFAS in our communities and communities across the country, and particularly in New Mexico, it's vital that we advance coordination and advance science and research on the impacts, cleanup, and alternatives to PFAS in order to address these issues. In New Mexico, we have had devastating impacts from PFAS contamination, especially in Curry and Otero counties in the eastern side of our state, where PFAS was used as in firefighting foams at Cannon Air Force Base that has led to contaminated drinking water supplies, private wells, and wells that supply dairies in the Ogallala Aquifer, and also contamination at Holloman Air Force Base, which has led to extensive groundwater contamination. PFAS has also been detected in water bodies throughout our state, and we are just beginning to scratch the surface and understanding the full picture of this contamination, the fate and transport of the contaminants within our communities, and the impacts on environmental and human health. Our dairies in particular, and the dairy industry is one of our leading agricultural industries, has been just devastated. Thousands of gallons of milk have been dumped and people's livelihoods have been destroyed by this contamination. So my question is really to Drs. Jaffé and Sunderland, which is how can we expedite and increase the speed of our understanding and our ability to measure these contaminants and to do remediation, especially in areas where there's been large-scale spills?
I'll start with how can we detect them, and perhaps Dr. Jaffé can take how can we remediate them. I think, so in terms of understanding and detecting PFAS, I think support for joint collaboration between EPA and NIST is essential. So we need standard methods that fully capture all of the compounds that we know are used in commerce, and we're innovating on those detection methods and making sure they're usable in the field. And I think another component of this that you touched on is just understanding all the different types of PFAS sources. So there are efforts underway, to integrate PFAS accounting into the toxic release inventory and other databases. And those, I think, with support from all of you, those efforts could be accelerated. I'll yield to Dr. Jaffé now.
Thank you for the question. So when we look at PFAS remediation, right now, most of our efforts are site-specific, where we have high concentrations of PFAS. When you're concerned about agricultural processes, dairy farms, we probably have very dispersed, very low concentration of PFAS. They may have been applied with sewage sludge, and that's much, much more challenging to remediate these large sites. We need to have more focused research. It could be the Department of Agriculture that focuses on that, on how to make these PFAS less bioavailable so they don't go back into the food chain, and how we may be able to sequester them. And there could be methods depending on which one that you could mobilize the PFAS a little bit more so that they get out of the root zone. We don't have a good methodology to address that right now.
Thank you to both of the doctors. It's just so urgent that we expedite this research and development and then expedite the cleanup of these communities. As I said, it's been economically devastating and also just devastating to these communities. So I appreciate the work that you all do. I'm heartened to see that the administration is helping to coordinate this work through the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I look forward to getting NDAA passed and advancing and supporting this committee's work on this effort. So thank you very much. And thank thank you to Representative Tonko for yielding, and I yield back.
Mr. Gonzalez is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you to the chairs and ranking members for holding this hearing today, and to our distinguished witnesses for joining us. While the science of PFAS continues to evolve, a couple things I think are clear. First, given the wide use of PFAS in so many products, these chemicals have found their way into the soil and in many cases our drinking water. That's obvious. Second, with a growing body of evidence directly linking PFAS to adverse health effects, we need to be doing more to improve our R&D efforts in surveillance, rapid testing, and treatment technologies. I want to particularly emphasize the importance of treatment technologies because regardless of any action taken by Congress or the EPA to regulate PFAS, many Americans could be drinking contaminated water for years if we don't identify and support solutions that will destroy these forever chemicals. Ms. Dindal, I appreciated your testimony, particularly your comments and recommendations on how we continue to make advances in these PFAS destruction technologies. I actually had the opportunity to visit one of Battelle's environmental labs back in 2019 in Columbus, Ohio, and it's extraordinary to see the progress that your organization has made with the Annihilator technology in such a short period of time. Also has an awesome name, so congrats on that. I think one thing we can take away from all the testimony we've heard is that total destruction of these chemicals is of the utmost importance, and the technologies at Battelle sound very promising. Could you please describe how you believe the Annihilator would work to remediate sites that are currently contaminated with PFAS in the groundwater? And does it work for contaminated soil?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. PFAS Annihilator is very applicable to groundwater treatment. It can be done in a number of scenarios. It can be used directly to treat that groundwater. In some sites, there are existing remediation systems that are in place, like granulated activated carbon or ion exchange, that are already pumping and treating at different sites. As opposed to replacing that with a new technology, we can work in augmentation with that technology. So that's another opportunity to scale quickly and not have to completely change to a new solution, but rather augment the solution that is there. You asked a question about soil as well. That is another area where we are focusing. We have an active DoD CERTA contract to develop the technology further for soil. Currently, the process is to get it in an aqueous state where we would remove the PFAS from the soil through a soil washing technique, and then we would destroy it with Annihilator, but we are working now on treating the solid material directly.
Great. How far along is that technology? It sounds like that's more in development than the other. How close are you all, you think, to really?
It is. The soil directly is in the early stage, but as I said, we do have a solution to wash the soil and then destroy that. It would just be a two-step process.
Great. And sort of related to that, could you share how your conversations have been going with federal agencies and how they want to use this technology at their waste sites? And then if there's barriers that the federal agencies are throwing up, I'd certainly love to hear about that as well.
We have been having a lot of conversations about this technology, particularly as we have begun to scale it and put it on this mobile platform. The conversations with DoD and EPA in particular, and the focus on a mobile technology that we can take the solution to the waste and not move the waste around through the nation has been positively received, and that is why we've built our second mobile unit also on a mobile platform. There's encouragement and engagement to utilize this technology. We do have a couple of current contracts with DoD to deploy the technology in the next year.
Great. Well, that's great to hear. Congratulations on all the progress. I know this committee is very excited to see what you all can do in this space. Thank you to the ranking members and the chairs, and I yield back.
Mr. Caston is recognized.
Thank you so much, and thanks to our witnesses. I want to dive sort of straight into questions, and I really just have some basic science questions, and I'm hoping you can help me, Dr. Sunderland. I'm proud to have supported the PFAS Action Act to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA and direct EPA to study whether it should be designated as a toxic pollutant. But I'm scratching my head a little bit because there was this FDA analysis about a year ago that, if I'm reading it right, suggests that food rather than water is the primary source of PFAS contamination for most Americans. And as I've gone through, that looks to be a measure of the number of people who have PFAS in their system, not necessarily the dosage. So, Dr. Underwood, I wonder if you can give us a little bit of an overview. Do we have a good sort of dose response data for PFAS? Is there such a thing as a safe level? Do we know? Give us a little bit of overview, if you could, on what the status of that science is.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. On the health side, there are many different health outcomes. And so in terms of establishing a dose response relationship, it would depend on the specific compound being considered and the types of effects that have been investigated. Certainly, we've seen for things like immune toxicity, then we've seen effects at high levels, we've seen effects in adults. So we've seen an association between PFAS exposure, for example, and severity of COVID-19 in adult populations. And then we've seen effects in terms of antibody production following routine vaccination in children. So for those types of effects, and I would say there's a whole suite of effects on the metabolic system, so human metabolism, which relate to things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So for those kinds of outcomes, we do have fairly well-established dose-response relationships. There are many, many new types of impacts being discovered all the time. You commented on this difference between, very astutely, we have high dose communities. So some of these contaminated communities that have drinking water exposures versus the general population. And I think it's worth noting that exposures in the general population are still of concern. And for those populations, it's true that we would think that diet is very important. And I guess one thing I really want to highlight for this committee is we have almost no data to characterize what are the most important exposure sources for the US general population. We should be concerned about everybody. We're most concerned about risk mitigation for those contaminated communities, but as soon as we get that under control, I think it's really important to also think about the whole population. And until we identify those predominant exposure strategies, it's very difficult to identify the most appropriate risk mitigation options. And our food supply has been systematically understudied. So most of our knowledge is from European data. And I don't want to be long-winded, so I'll stop there.
And I don't want to misunderstand that. Are you suggesting that the highly exposed populations are more likely from water-based exposure, or do we answer that?
Yeah, so we have highly exposed populations from a variety. Like, it is possible to get highly exposed populations from a variety of in a variety of ways. The ones that we've looked at most closely are these contaminated communities, but we also have data on population level exposures from CDC. And there are ways that people in the general population can also be highly exposed through use of products, through dietary ingestion and other sources. And we simply don't have enough data on those what we would call the US general population outside of these contaminated communities to really have an informed response right now. And I think that's a really big gap in our knowledge that needs to be addressed.
All right, so with the little time I have left, I have a dumb and sort of selfish question. I represent a fairly affluent district in the Chicago suburbs. It doesn't have a military base in it. We certainly have our pockets of inequality, but I think we're generally more fortunate than most. But on the other hand, last time I did a poll, 100% of my constituents eat food. Can you just tell us how do you personally, in your expertise, think about nonstick cookware? Is it a thing we should be concerned about? What would you advise people who eat and cook to do, given what you know as a scientist?
I mean, I'm a strong believer in the cast iron pans and not using nonstick cookware, but I rely a lot on my husband for cooking, so I'm looking after. So what can I say? These are personal choices, right? And I think that there's a variety of advice we can give to people to mitigate their personal exposures to PFAS in products. That is one of the handles that we could reduce exposures for the general population by phasing out the non-essential uses in some of those products.
Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time. I may follow up on the record to see if your husband's got some good good recipes for us. But thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Ross is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our subcommittee chairwomen and also to the ranking members for holding this very important hearing. I've been doing a lot of work on PFAS issues, bipartisan work, because of all the contamination in North Carolina. My home state of North Carolina knows PFAS issues too well. Chemical companies have polluted the Cape Fear River with PFAS for years. And I've worked on these issues both with Congressman Hudson and Congressman Rouser, so I appreciate Representative Bice's emphasis on the bipartisan work that we're doing on this. But tests of drinking water in my district, including Raleigh and Cary, have also detected PFAS. Fortunately, though, my district also includes NC State University, home to researchers and scientists who've dedicated their time and expertise to assessing PFAS exposure, bioaccumulation, and remediation, as well as the harmful health effects that can result from exposures to these forever chemicals. And in October, I had the privilege of touring NC State Center for Environmental Health and effects of PFAS, where I witnessed the incredible work our scientists are undertaking to learn more about these chemicals. That same day, I joined EPA Administrator Michael Regan in North Carolina to announce the Biden administration's plan to combat PFAS pollution in the government-wide effort with 8 federal agencies, and several people have referenced this plan. I understand that it had its first meeting to discuss coordination, and Ms. Hendershott, I don't know if you followed that meeting, but recognizing that these initiatives are in their early stages, can you speak to what you've seen so far? And if you don't know what's happened in that meeting, I'd love to hear from our other experts here.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. I'm not sure exactly which meeting you're talking about, but if we're referring to the EPA PFAS roadmap, I am very encouraged by the coordinated actions that EPA is going to be taking. I would further request that all of the federal agencies coordinate at the national level, at a very high level, to strategize on PFAS response, because I don't think one agency or one department has all the answers. And so I think, as we've learned in Michigan, that a coordinated response all the way, from the low levels of field work up to the strategic decisions for implementation and process are really, really important, including our general public. So not wanting to leave the public out of it, but I think the roadmap is a great first step, but there are many, many more steps to take.
And to be clear, that meeting was a meeting of the Joint Subcommittee on Environment, Innovation, and Public Health. Did anybody else follow that meeting and have any reactions to the first steps? Maybe not. Okay. Then for all of the witnesses, what do you hope this interagency coordinating body will accomplish as it relates to our R&D needs? Maybe Dr. Sunderland, do you have any comment on that?
So the body that recently met, what do we?
The interagency coordinating body, yeah, we're with the 8 different agencies.
Yeah, well, I think we've heard many ideas for what we hope that this body accomplishes, and they broadly fall within the areas of exposure and risk mitigation, comprehensively identifying the health outcomes associated with these compounds, thinking about the remediation techniques, making them available, and then comprehensive source identification across the country. So, and I think it was highlighted a moment ago as well. There are many steps that we need to take. So if others want to comment as well, I'd welcome their input.
Well, let me shift because I only have 26 seconds left. One of the efforts that we've taken in North Carolina with advocates is to get Chemours, which has done most of the PFAS contamination, to bear some of the financial responsibilities for research. And so do you agree that the federal government and academic research institutions should not have to bear the full cost of needed PFAS research, and that industry should be required to chip in, particularly when they were part of the cost?
I absolutely agree.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Mr. Jimenez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee is recognized.
Thank you very much to the two chairs for holding this really important hearing. This is a subject that I've spent a lot of time on. So for Chairwoman Stevens and Chairwoman Sherrill, thank you. I've been working on these issues ever since I learned about the people that I represent in Oscoda having been exposed to PFAS. And we know from this testimony and from research that these chemicals are linked to health issues, thyroid disease, cancer, et cetera. The people of Oscoda have been dealing with this because the military used firefighting foam containing PFAS that has leached into the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base and into their drinking water. And even though the base has been closed for 30 years, the people of Oscoda are still dealing with these impacts. But of course, it's not the only community dealing with PFAS contamination. In fact, a couple of years ago, when Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick and I, my Republican colleague, founded the Bipartisan Congressional PFAS Task Force, we didn't have that many members involved because people didn't know about it. This task force now has more than 60 members, and it's because as we discover the extent of PFAS contamination, members of Congress understand that we have this responsibility to step up and defend the people that we work for. And that's why I am so happy that this continues to be very much a bipartisan effort. One of the ways that people are exposed to PFAS is through drinking water when firefighting foam containing PFAS leaches into the groundwater. This affects those folks, but also particularly affects firefighters who are exposed to PFAS when they use this foam. And obviously, firefighters have a much higher rate of cancer. And so we have this obligation to protect communities, and especially to protect those firefighters. We were able, through this committee, to pass legislation that would require both military and civilian airports to find alternatives to PFAS containing firefighting foam. And to help with the transition, again, through this committee, I was able to secure $95 million in the Build Back Better Act, which hopefully will come to the president's desk in the not too distant future, to replace firefighting foam containing PFAS. So this is an area I'm really curious about. And I want to start with Ms. Hendershott, if you might address how, assuming the Build Back Better dollars are delivered, how this would help you and sort of what the state of play is in terms of being able to remove PFAS firefighting foam from the environment.
Absolutely. Great question. Thank you, Representative Kildee. So, as I said, Michigan's been collecting, we've collected over 51,000 gallons of PFAS containing AFFF. But as Ms. Dindal said, the research on a fluorine-free, truly fluorine-free foam is still in the process. So we need to do better than what we've got for right now for Class B while the research continues. I think there needs to be measures to look at what is truly fluorine-free, what's the next best thing until we can get that research. It's unfair for us to collect the Class B firefighting foam and then not give additional options to our firefighters. They're out there on the first lines, and it's really my thoughts are to make sure that they're one, protected, that we're not exposing them to the Class B AFFF anymore, but also that they have appropriate measures for replacement. And I don't know that we're quite there yet, but there are best management practices that we can put in place so that when they do have to use it, environmental cleanup is done quickly, it's contained, and we want to minimize the use of it as much as possible.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Hendershott, for your testimony, for that answer, but especially for the great work you're doing. I'm proud of the way the state of Michigan has taken this challenge on. I want to quickly turn, if I could, back to Dindal. I was really taken by your testimony, and particularly Mr. Gonzalez's questions about the use of this technology that you've been developing when it comes to treatment of groundwater, particularly as it might work in concert with GAC filtration. Can you help me understand sort of the cost and scalability? I know you mentioned the scalability to be able to get to, say, a 5,000 gallon per day threshold, but help me understand what the all-in costs of this might be once taken to scale as compared to the cost of implementing GAC filtration, which has been a limitation in some, and I know this is the case in Oscoda, in our ability to sort of take this on at scale. Could you address that?
Yes, I can. And thank you for your leadership with the Bipartisan PFAS Task Force. It certainly has been impactful. And I appreciate your question. We are certainly focused on bringing forward an economically viable solution because we know that if the technology is not affordable, it won't be adopted. And we have been evaluating cost of current demonstration projects. We will be doing that as part of our current demonstration projects with DoD as we look at the scale and what the cost will be involved. That cost data will provide cost data on the implementation in a real world scenario, as the cost could vary from site to site depending on the site conditions. I will say that EPA did cite some cost to dispose of AFFF in a recent publication, and it was on the order of $28 per gallon. So we certainly understand that that's an unsustainable cost, and we want to be able to provide the most cost-effective solution possible.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you all for your work. An excellent hearing with excellent witnesses. I yield back.
Mr. Foster is recognized.
Thank you. Am I audible and visible here?
You are, sir.
Okay. Well, first off, of immediate concern here, for Ms. Dindal, is waterborne PFAS destroyed by putting it through a coffee machine?
By putting it through a coffee machine?
Coffee machine, yeah. I mean, or do you need the supercritical pressure and the other additives to actually destroy the chemical in addition to the heat and boiling temperatures?
Yes, sir. The technology is based on supercritical water oxidation, which indicates that it is at a certain pressure and temperature. It becomes in the supercritical state, sure, and it can be added an oxidant in order to break the CF bond.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm struggling with the biotoxicity thresholds for all these things. We had an issue in my district having to do with ethylene oxide, where it was a huge amount of uncertainty about what the safe concentration is. And there's obviously a wide variety of PFAS compounds, and I would not be surprised to find orders of magnitude differences in the safe concentrations of those different compounds. And so my question, I guess, to Dr. Jaffé or whoever wants to handle it, what would a systematic program to actually identify the biotoxicity thresholds of all the different compounds, or at least the most important ones, what would that look like? And the rough time scale and dollar cost? Whoops, I think you're muted if you're.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I was saying I'm probably the least qualified to answer this question because I'm not a toxicologist. But what we need to understand is how toxicology is linked to molecular structures. Instead of looking at a molecule at a time, how can we sort of find groups that are toxic and which ones do we have to be concerned about? As I mentioned earlier, there are 4,700 PFAS, and it's hard to look at them one by one. So look at the molecular structure, see what part is of concern, what part is toxic. And
Ms. Sunderland, do you want to have
yes.
a shot at that?
Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think the first point I would make is that we actually don't have any kind of health information available for the majority of these compounds. And Dr. Jaffé mentioned the 4,600 plus, which has recently been upgraded to 9,000 plus potential structures. So there's a big challenge here where we only have actual data for a few of these compounds. And certainly the health outcomes associated with exposures to those compounds are quite different. So we have a few well-studied PFAS. We have many that we need to consider. There are programs at EPA which are looking at this. So things like the ToxCast program, high throughput screening, linking some of these detection methods to toxicological assays. These show a lot of promise, and I think we could leverage from these. There are some great people at EPA working on these programs. I also think we have to think about this idea of mixtures. So that, do we want to think about health impacts associated with PFAS one by one, or do we want to think about it in the way that's relevant to how we're exposed to these compounds? So we may get a certain mixture of PFAS through AFFF exposure. We're going to get a different mixture of PFAS compounds through consumer products and diet and other pathways. So this kind of research is really important. NIH has some important research going on in this area. It's an area I think that research needs to be supported to get some of those answers to that important question you just asked.
Yeah. Oh, has anyone gone through and tried to generate a project scope and estimate for really nailing this? Or is it simply impossible because ultimately what you need are long-term human exposures, which is not something that we're willing or eager to do?
Certainly there's some data. I think that part of the limitation right now on the health side is actually detection. So characterizing, the chemistry is so interwoven with understanding the health outcomes that until we know what the exposure vector is, it's difficult to say, comprehensively an answer to your question. I think there certainly are preliminary data on this that provide a partial answer to your question, but we haven't nailed it, as you say. So it's something that we need to keep looking at. There's some great work going on at NIH right now, also with animal models, looking at some of these.
Yeah, but those are limited to short-term, very high concentrations. And I know in the ethylene oxide thing, what we were interested in is long-term, very low concentration exposures. And the important question of, is there actually a biological safe dose of this, which completely controls the cost of mitigation that you get to. So it's anyway, thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Wild is recognized.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the testimony of our witnesses today to illustrate the work that we still need to do to understand and address PFAS risk. Earlier this year, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection conducted surveys of more than 400 sites across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania suspected to have PFAS contamination and found at least one PFAS chemical in a third of those tested sites. The state is now moving forward to protect our drinking water with a limit on PFOA and PFOS, two common types of PFAS, to ensure that the more than 3,000 water systems across Pennsylvania measure and limit these chemicals to no more than 14 or 18 parts per trillion, respectively. But as our witnesses have noted, there are so many more research questions, including how we can also assess our air quality, understand impact on our health, or detect any type of PFAS chemical. So I'd like to start, Ms. Hendershott, in your testimony, you mentioned that Michigan developed water quality standards for PFOA and PFOS using both expertise in the state and with support from national experts. And of course, as a representative in Pennsylvania, where we are taking these initiatives, where our governor and his administration are taking these initiatives, I'd love to know what went well in terms of the collaboration between state experts in Michigan and those at the national level, and any recommendations that you might give to leaders in my state as they move forward with a similar standard.
I think the biggest recommendation would be to continue to collaborate, gather the best available science, and make sure we're making the right assumptions. we did a great job of communicating both with our internal experts and the external national experts. But even in 2 years, the science is rapidly changing. There's so much more that we know today than we did 2 years ago when we started that process. And so I think gathering as many of the national experts together to really give you the best available science, because once these things are set, obviously it takes a lot longer for us to change MCLs than the science does to improve our understanding and knowledge. So just making sure we're working with the best available modeling and the best available human health outcomes, as Dr. Sunderland was talking about, is really, really important for us.
Well, thank you. And I will tell you, and this is for the whole panel, when I started running for Congress, before I was even elected, one of the very first community groups I met with were from a region in my district that has very serious PFAS concerns and contaminants. And so this is something I've been hearing about from the beginning. And it continues that I hear about this from my constituents. So I really appreciate the testimony today. I want to make sure that I have good context for my constituents and anyone else learning about this topic to understand the current science. And so Dr. Sunderland, and then anybody else who would like to answer, how should we as members talk about this issue in our districts with concerned constituents and perhaps with constituents who have never heard of PFAS, don't know what it is, and don't know what the possible impact could be? That was for Dr. Sunderland.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think, the way I approach interactions with communities is to first ask them, I guess, what they're concerned about most. And you've mentioned that there are community members who've already expressed concern. So I think listening to the things that people are concerned about, in my experience, the general population is concerned about ways that they are exposed through consumer products and providing helpful tips on how to reduce their personal exposures if they're concerned about it. I think balancing these risk messages is really important. So and there's been a lot of concern among the federal agencies about creating a sort of frenzied climate of fear around these chemicals. And what we're instead trying to do is say, okay, well, if this is something of personal concern, here are ways that you can reduce exposures. And then for those populations that we know are already at risk, we're doing our best to find some of the technologies and some of the solutions for reducing those exposures in the very short term. So that's, I guess, where I'd start. I'd welcome input from others on that conversation as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'd love their input too, but unfortunately my time is up, as is so often the case in these hearings. But thank you very much, Dr. Sunderland. Thank you to the entire panel.
I just want to echo that. Thank you so much to our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. Unfortunately, I need to step away. So Representative Stevens will be taking the chair for the remainder of the hearing. Thanks so much.
So be it. Now we'll recognize our next witness. Who do we have in the queue, please?
Ms. Fletcher is recognized.
Ms. Fletcher.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Stevens, and of course to Chairwoman Sherrill, who just left, as well as to everyone who's here today. I'm really grateful that you're holding this important hearing, and very grateful to our witnesses for taking the time to testify on this important topic today. Some of my questions relate to things that I have already heard some of my colleagues ask, which I think to me just underscores the importance of some of the issues that we've been focused on in our committee. And of course, want to thank my colleague Dan Kildee for his work on the PFAS task force, which I'm very glad to be a part of as well. And some of his questions about the firefighting foam relate directly to some of my concerns that got me involved and interested in this topic when we had a very large chemical fire in the Houston Ship Channel right outside of my district, and we were very focused on the PFAS and the firefighting foam used to fight those very difficult fires to put out, and the resulting PFAS contamination that we found down into Galveston Bay. So a lot of concerns in my community, as are people across the country concerned with these issues. And so I'm really grateful for your insights today. Last year, I introduced a bill in the last Congress, and it's the Federal PFAS Research Evaluation Act, and that will direct EPA to work with the national academies to conduct a series of research studies on PFAS. The studies in my bill would advance the research on human exposure and toxicity hazard estimations, as well as the environmental hazards and treatment of PFAS contamination. So I really appreciate the insights that I've already heard from our witnesses on these issues, and to help us really further refine this bill and this effort before reintroducing it in this Congress. So I guess maybe with the time I have, I'd love to just put this question generally out to all of you to weigh in on how comprehensive studies to identify research gaps and help advance the field of PFAS research and development could be useful. And maybe if you could just share your thoughts on the types of questions you think that these kinds of studies should tackle. Maybe I'll just start. I'd love to hear from all of you. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Sunderland, since you mentioned in your testimony that threat exposure research falls under the mandate of the EPA. Could you elaborate on the type of exposure research EPA should conduct, and then again, kind of what kinds of questions you think studies about the gaps could tackle?
Yeah, thank you very much for that important question, and for asking that. I think for EPA and for this general theme of exposure research, we basically need studies that systematically look in a representative way for different populations across the country at what the exposure sources and pathways are. And believe it or not, that is missing for the majority of individuals. So we've talked a lot about contaminated drinking water. And I think because we've recognized that as a problem, and because the states have been so proactive about that, we've made a lot of progress on both understanding concentrations in drinking water across the country, and also understanding, who's exposed and who's at risk. So that's wonderful. That's a great success. Unfortunately, we don't have a comparable research program for things like dietary exposure. There's, some preliminary work from FDA, but it's not statistically representative of the US population and different demographic groups. And this is where EPA really has a specialty. So if given the mandate to do that kind of work, in a representative, the key here is in a representative way for the whole for different demographic groups in the population. So I'm thinking of something analogous to what the CDC does with NHANES, but from the exposure perspective for PFAS. So I would love to see that kind of work. It's not inexpensive, so it would have to be a partnership probably between CDC, ATSDR, and EPA, but it would fill, in my mind, a big gap in knowledge that's so important for really taking those risk mitigation actions now. And that's really ultimately what people are most concerned about, because they're asking all of you, what should I do? How do I reduce my exposure? And we can tell people in contaminated communities, we can provide an answer, but not elsewhere. So thank you for that question.
Congresswoman Fletcher, we're losing you. You got on mute.
Well, I used up my time, so thank you so much, Chairwoman Stevens. I was going to say, since I was coming to the end of my time, I would love it if any of our other witnesses would submit an answer to that question for the record after the conclusion of the hearing. I appreciate it and appreciate all of your testimony. Thank you again, Chairwoman Stevens. I yield back.
Fabulous. And for the good of the order, do we have anyone else in the queue for questions right now? Members for questions?
No, we do not, Ms. Stevens.
Okay, I thought we had that accurately. Well, thank you so much to our witnesses for your expert testimony. Several members have already recognized that they'll be submitting questions for the record. Clearly, PFAS remains a topic of the day, a topic of our time, and this committee will remain very dedicated to the R&D efforts, as well as the environmental implications in terms of how we remediate PFAS, how we identify PFAS, and how we prevent the worst of its impacts. And certainly we are one exclusive committee in the Congress, but when we talk about a whole of government approach and we talk about the multitude of agencies that will involve this work, we also recognize that we've got to take an all of Congress approach, and that we will have this committee and energy and commerce and certainly some of the other regulatory effects that need to be addressed here. And we're always in favor of, the agencies that we have direct oversight over, particularly NIST, in terms of their public-private partnership and advisory approach. The EPA as well is going to play obviously an oversized role. So we look forward to the dialogue. We salute your work. And with that, the record's going to remain open for 2 weeks for these questions for the record. All right. So members are going to have time to submit those, and we'll get back to you, or look forward to hearing back from you. But with that, the committee will be adjourned, and thank you all so much.